morning, everybody. Oh, I'm so excited that you're here. My name is Beth Boatwright. I am the Director of Community Partnerships and Programs at Allen County Public Library, and I'm so excited to welcome you today to our keynote with Angela Jackson Brown. I was at the first event just a few minutes ago, and many of you were there as well, talking with several local authors from our community. And the thing I kept hearing was about how our stories, especially for those of us who write, the stories are just inside bursting, ready to get out. We all have so many stories to tell, and the stories come out wherever we might be. Sharon Tubbs shared that her descriptive storytelling sometimes came out when she was writing for the newspaper, and her editors was like, maybe not so descriptive, but now she's a published author, and it's wonderful. Last night, I got a chance to chat with Angela Jackson Brown and her husband. Her husband was talking about how her stories come out in her beautiful office, but also, all over the house and wherever she might be. Sometimes you just have to get the words out. You just have to write. This month at Allen County Public Library, we're celebrating Family History Month, celebrating the stories that we and our forebears have lived and the journeys of discovery that we get to go on now to discover through genealogy, like our own stories, our own family history. Our keynote this morning has been made possible by a grant from the Indiana Humanities. It's another organization that exists to highlight the richness of art and history and letters in our state. And would you join me in thanking them for making this event possible? We are so grateful. We're so grateful for their grant and their generosity toward us. One last group that is deeply committed to storytelling in our community is the Friends of the Allen County Public Library. The Friends have experienced kind of a renaissance of late, and in fact, this weekend is the kickoff of National Friends of the Library Week, and we are very grateful for their support. I'm about to introduce our featured guest this morning, but before I do, let me tell you that after her keynote, there's going to be an opportunity for you to ask some questions. So as you listen, be thinking about what questions that you might have, and also how many copies of her new novel you'd like to purchase upstairs after this event. Angela Jackson Brown is an award-winning writer, poet, and playwright who's a member of the faculty of the Creative Writing Program at Indiana University Bloomington and is associate professor there. She's a graduate of Troy University, Auburn University, and the Graduate School of Writing at Spalding. She has published her short fiction, creative nonfiction, and poetry in journals like the Louisville Journal and the Appalachian Review. She's the author of Drinking from a Bitter Cup, House Repairs, When Stars Rain Down, and The Light Always Breaks. When Stars Rain Down is a highly acclaimed novel that received a starred review from the Library Journal and glowing reviews from Alabama Public Library, BuzzFeed, Parade Magazine, Women's Weekly, just to name a few. I'm very, very excited that she's here. It was also named a finalist for the David J. Langham Senior Prize in American Historical Fiction. Her academic research I'm fascinated by. It's on the topics of co-constructed autoethnography, collaborative teaching, critical service learning, and e-learning, and it's been showcased in publications like the Journal of Black Studies and the Journal of Community Engagement in Higher Education. When I was in academia, those were the types of research projects that really could launch engagement with students, and that was so exciting to read about. She is the playwright and producer of several plays, including Anna's Wings, Black Lives Matter 2, It Is Well, and Still Singing Those Weary Blues. She collaborated on the musical Dear Bobby Kennedy with the King Memorial Initiative. Musical Dear Bobby with the Kennedy King Memorial Initiative. And earlier this year, her newest play, Trailer Park Love Story, was debuted in Birmingham, Alabama. Her newest novel, Homeward, was released just a few days ago and tells the story of a woman finding her way through the tumult of the civil rights movement in the early 1960s. I've heard that it is as immersive as her previous work and as vibrant and engaging as the author herself. I'm so excited. Please join me in welcoming Angela Jackson Brown.
Y'all sound tired. Hello. Hello, everyone. It is so wonderful to see you this morning. Oh my goodness, I am so happy to be here. I want to thank you all for coming out on a Saturday morning, on a rainy Saturday morning, no less, to help me celebrate the publication of my fourth novel, my fifth book total, and to listen to me talk a little bit about the historical relevance of this book for the times that we are living in. I keep thinking that publishing a book will eventually get old to me, but it doesn't. Each and every time my publisher delivers a copy of my next book, I get that same giddy feeling that I used to get when my books from the Scholastic Book Fair would arrive. And some of y'all know what I'm talking about, some of y'all too young, but for those of us who remember the Scholastic Book Fair, there was nothing like that day when the teacher would have those books and you would get them and it would just, ooh. Well, I tell you, it's that same feeling when it's your book and your name is on the cover. This dream of writing and finding an audience has been with me since I was a small child, thanks largely to the love and vision of my daddy, MC Jackson. It wasn't an MFA program that first told me I could be a writer. It was my daddy, a World War II veteran who was a sharecropper and had to quit school in the 10th grade to work on the family farm. I always speak his name on days like this, especially when I'm reading in places where I know he probably would not have been allowed to be in, or if he had been allowed to be in, he most definitely would not have been speaking to a crowd like you. So I am appreciative to everyone here at the Allen County Public Library for welcoming me here this weekend, especially Craig Bailey, Beth Boatwright, Steve Miller, Megan Bell, and every other member of the library staff who has shown me and my husband so much graciousness. I told him I might not go back to Bloomington. Y'all know how to treat a girl here. So I really enjoyed myself, and I'm so grateful for all of the kindness that you all have shown me. My most recent novel that I'll be focusing on today started coming to me in 2020, mainly because I knew I wasn't ready to let go of the people of my fictional town of Parsons, Georgia. I wanted to see what was going to happen to them next. So I decided after a few starts and stops that the early 1960s would be a good place for me to begin the journey for this book and to bring these characters back into the world. Now, the ironic thing is that when I started writing the book, I had no clue that the book would ultimately debut in 2023, 60 years after so many of the historical events that I write about that took place 60 years ago that are in this book, such as the Children's Crusade, the assassination of Medgar Evers, the March on Washington, the bombing of 16th Street Baptist Church, and the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. All of those things happened 60 years ago. In a lifetime, you know, the idea that those historical things happened and there's still people walking around on earth that remembering it is mind-boggling, you know? So I recognized the importance of doing the due diligence to get the historical details correct. So I spent a good deal of time just ensuring that. The Children's Crusade that took place in Birmingham, Alabama is only a few sentences in my novel, but it sets the mood for the novel in so many ways, not to mention it sets the mood and the momentum for the early days of the civil rights movement of the 1960s. I've got my pages marked, so hopefully I can get us through them fairly quickly. So on page 167, it reads, "Daddy jumped up from his seat like he'd suddenly been scalded with hot water. I knew that Reverend Hamilton was not going to be good for this community. He slinked into town and started spiriting away the members of Little Bethel with his fancy talk and his shiny suits. Bringing that Dr. King to Parsons is just going to get those white folks riled up," he said. "Excuse me, but I need to go inside and call the leadership of the church. Maybe we can talk some sense into Hamilton before he turns Parsons into Birmingham, Alabama." Daddy was referring to the march that had taken place last Friday in Birmingham. It had been horrible to watch on the news. Walter Cronkite had sounded so solemn as he shared images of young black children getting assaulted but with water hoses, attack dogs, and billy clubs. Mama had become so upset Daddy had turned off the television, but we couldn't stop seeing the horror of it all in our eyes. There's been a general belief that all black people in the South supported the civil rights movement and Dr. King. But what I found in my research and from my own family experience is that that just wasn't the case. I remember as a little girl asking my daddy if he had marched with Dr. King. I just knew my big, strong daddy had been out there marching with Dr. King, getting spit on and pushed around like the black people I saw on the television. But Daddy said to me, not everyone could march with King. Some of us had to focus on living. As a little girl, I could not understand his words or his logic. In my little microcosm of the universe, there was good, there was evil, there was brave, there was cowardly, there was black, there was white. There were no shades of gray. So I could not understand back then how my daddy and other black people could choose not to get involved in the movement. It didn't make sense to me. But as I grew older and wiser, my daddy's words began to make sense. Black people were afraid during the 1960s, and rightly so. My daddy and his family were sharecroppers, as I mentioned before, and none of them were fortunate enough to get past the 9th or 10th grade. My daddy was a World War II veteran who served in the Navy, but when he came back home to our little town of Ayrton, Alabama, shortly after World War II ended, instead of a ticker tape parade or an opportunity to work at a job that was befitting of a war veteran, instead he was met with racists holding rifles, threatening him within an inch of his life that if he went through the door where he would go to vote, register to vote, he would not walk out alive. My daddy and so many other men were destroyed emotionally by the hate that this country showed them as they risked their lives for the red, white, and blue. My people lived with the threat of lynchings, church and home bombings, and all-around harassment for even thinking about protesting their conditions. So I finally understood my daddy's words. I guess what they say, with age does come wisdom. So when I sat down to write this novel, I wanted to illustrate that not every black person felt confident or even brave enough to stand up against the hatred of the 1960s. And their stories deserve to be told as well. And then there were some black people like the Perkins family in my novel who had reached upward mobility. And they did not want to do anything that they considered unnecessary attention to themselves or their communities. And I can't be angry with that. I would like to believe that in another life, I would have been like a Harriet Tubman or a Sojourner Truth. But the chances are greater that I would have done like so many other black people in history whose names we do not know. I would have bided my time and prayed for a better day, and I would have hoped that if I didn't get to see freedom, maybe my future children or grandchildren or great-grandchildren would. Instead of raging against the proverbial machine, I probably would have done an honest day's work, kept my head down, and waited for something or someone outside of myself to fight the good fight. So by highlighting the children's crusade in my novel, in just that little bitty snippet, a crusade that consisted of over 1,000 black youth ranging in ages from 6 to teenage, I hope to show that the movement, as we called it, was primarily spearheaded by young people. If you go through the list of people that were involved as leaders, as well as those who were followers, so many of them were children and teenagers and young people. So many people on the front lines weren't even old enough to vote, but they understood that freedom is not free. And they were willing to pay the ultimate price so that they and others like them could have the rights and the privileges that I and others like me now have. Because of the bravery of those children, some barely old enough to write their own names, I now have the privilege to walk onto IU campus and go into a classroom and teach a room full of students. I have the ability to walk into the Allen County Public Library and talk to you all for a little while about a book that I wrote. A vision that, thank you, thank you. A vision that none of my ancestors would have had the audacity to believe could happen for someone in their family line. I've heard the quote, "I am my ancestors' greatest hope." I think we all can say that on one level or another, that all of us, for whatever path we chose, we've inched our family line a little bit closer to where they hoped we might ultimately go someday. And that's something for all of us to be proud of. I spent roughly 10 months doing the research for Homeward, basically the gestation period of a baby. My reading list was extensive. I consulted newspaper articles, old news footage. I read biographies and autobiographies of those in the movement. I read about those who didn't support the movement as well as those who did. I talked to people who lived during that time and experienced the civil rights movement up close and personal. All in all, I read dozens upon dozens of books and watched hours upon hours of footage, but Homeward is also filled with details, with things I and my family experienced firsthand. This next excerpt is taken from a page from my life. The photo you see is of a backcountry road my daddy and I were traveling on from our home in Ayrton, Alabama, to a small rural church in New Brockton. Some parts of this scene are made up, but other parts are exactly as it happened and are still etched on my brain as if it just happened yesterday. There's a really ugly word in this text. I'm gonna dance around it a little bit, but I didn't dance around it in the text. It's on page 303. Before Daddy could pull the car back into the road, we heard a siren behind us. We both turned and looked. It was a police car. I felt my stomach begin to twist. I prayed the car kept going, but it slowed to a stop behind us. Daddy reached over and patted my leg. "It's all right, Rose. It's all right. Just let me do the talking." I was so scared. I couldn't even say anything. I gripped the bottom of my seat and started silently praying. "Hand me the registration papers in the glove box and then put your hands on the dash where he can see them," Daddy said. "Hurry up." I fumbled with the door of the glove compartment until finally I was able to get it opened. I pulled out the paperwork and handed it to Daddy right before the policeman reached in the window. I made sure my hands were flat-palmed on the dash of the car. I felt the tears begin to lap underneath my chin, but I didn't dare wipe them away. "What y'all doing out here?" My heart felt like it was going to jump out of my chest. I knew that voice. It was the policeman who had hurt me. I felt like screaming and running, but I knew if I did any of those things, it would not end well. I just sat there with my head bowed, tears dropping like huge raindrops. "We're on our way to work, sir," Daddy said in a voice that didn't sound like him. He sounded like Step and Fetch It or Amos and Andy. When we were kids, he wouldn't let us listen or watch those shows. He said being a Negro was hard enough. We didn't need those negative stereotypes haunting us. But here we were, Daddy having to do the very thing he hated, sound ignorant, so these white folks would feel better about us and not hurt us. I had just pulled over to talk to my daughter. "You don't know how to drive and talk at the same time?" he asked. "Hey, gal, what was you and your daddy talking about?" "She a bit on the shy side, sir," Daddy said. I got my registration and driver's license if you be wanting to see them." The policeman snatched the license and paperwork out of Daddy's hands. "How a Negro like you get a car like this?" I don't even have a car like this, he said, his voice sounding angrier and angrier. Get out the car. He opened the door, ripped it open so hard I expected the door to come off the hinges. Daddy, I cried. Don't. It's okay, Daddy said. Everything is going to be okay. Oh, thank you. I remember that day like it was yesterday. I remember being a little girl and seeing my big, brave daddy turn into somebody that I did not recognize. And in that moment, I was embarrassed. I felt like he had done something to shame us. And I remember not talking to him for the rest of that ride, and he didn't talk to me. But years later, when my dad was dying of lung cancer, and I started kind of playing over all of these incidents that we experienced together and lived through, I realized in that moment, Daddy had one goal, and that was to make sure that he got his little girl safely to the place we were going to. And if that meant he had to shuck and jive or be Amos and Andy or talk dialect so that the man in front of us would let us go, then that's what he was willing to do. And so for me, it's important that those stories get remembered, not to make anyone feel bad, not to make anyone feel as if they have to take responsibility for what their ancestors did, but for us to remember that this happened in a lifetime. I'm standing in front of you. I consider myself not old. This happened in my lifetime. So we have to be able to acknowledge that the world that we inherited, for better or for worse, was not perfect. But we have to find a way to move on from our past and create a future that we all can feel good about leaving our children and grandchildren. I first remember hearing the name Medgar Evers when Whoopi Goldberg's film Ghosts of Mississippi was released in 1996. I would like to think I was aware of Medgar Evers before that film, but to be honest, that is my earliest memory of Whoopi playing Merle Evers and the actor from Grey's Anatomy, James Pinkins Jr., playing Medgar Evers. The story of Evers was not part of my public education nor my private education. I, in some ways, feel ashamed to say his name was not familiar to me before then, but once I knew about Evers, I vowed to pay tribute to him someday, and I got the opportunity to do so in this book. I wanted readers to see how a death like Evers would affect people like those in my fictional town of Parsons, Georgia. Some of the work that Evers did was to register voters, and registering voters in the era after Reconstruction was not an easy process for Black people. It wasn't like we do now. You know, you go get your driver's license renewed, they ask you if you want to vote, they tell you where to go vote, and that's the end of it. Back then, it was far more complicated, it was far more insidious, and it was far more heartbreaking. And so what Medgar Evers did was to try to take some of the trauma from the process by preparing people. And part of that was preparing people for the voter registration test. Have any of you ever seen the test that Black people were required to take in order to register to vote? I want you to Google it when you get an opportunity. I have some of the questions in the book, but I want you just to Google the tests. And you got to keep in mind that the majority of the people that were taking these tests did not have formal education. Many of them could not read or write. Some of them could not even sign their own names. They would put an X to indicate their names. And they were asked questions like, you need to recite the Declaration of Independence verbatim. And if you skip over a word, or if you mispronounce a word, then you fail. You have to name all the members of the House of Representatives. My grandfather, everybody called him Mr. Lee Jackson. He liked the Mr. part. He would go to the stores, the white stores where he'd go to buy things, and they'd say, "What's your name?" He says, "Mr. Lee Jackson." And they say, Lee is your first name? No, Mr. My name is Mr. So everybody in the family just called him Mr. Lee Jackson because that's the name he wanted to be recognized as. But Mr. Lee Jackson went to register to vote. And my daddy was telling me when he went there that day, there was a big jar, about yay big, and it was filled with candy. And the test was Mr. Lee had to guess how many pieces of candy was in the jar. And if he could guess how many pieces of candy were in the jar, then he could register to vote. Now, you would think that stubborn old coot would have given up. He looked at that jar and said, "You know what? Guess it's not meant for me to vote in this lifetime," but not Mr. Lee. He kept going back and guessing and guessing and guessing and guessing and guessing and guessing. Unfortunately, Mr. Lee, as far as I've been told, did not get to vote before he died. But he never gave up on that dream, which is why I'm always so angry when people tell me they didn't vote, because I think about Mr. Lee and I think about my daddy walking through those lines of white men with rifles saying that he couldn't vote. And I'm thinking about all of the people that gave their life during the civil rights movement so that we could vote. And the idea that any one of us would make up an excuse to not vote. You know, the idea to say, "Oh, there's not a candidate that I like." Oh my goodness, honey, this is not, you're not going on a date. You're trying to put somebody in office. I've heard people say, "Well, I want somebody I'd like to have a beer with, or somebody I'd like to go out and have a cup of coffee with." I said, "Don't you have friends?" This is serious business. And so when I write about topics like this, it's not just to write something to entertain readers. I hope that happens. But it's to remind readers of how far we've come and how far we have to go. As a writer, I take this very seriously and very personally. By June of 1963, many of the black population of my fictional town are studying for the voter registration test. They are studying under the fear of reprisal from racists in their town. Then they learn about the murder of Medgar Evers in Jackson, Mississippi. Evers wasn't as well known by the general population outside of Mississippi, but he was known by the activists in my novel. For some, his death caused fear, and they deserted the movement, and a reaction that is born out of historical accounts. Every time a lynching happened, every time an act of violence happened, more and more people backed away from the idea of being involved in the civil rights movement. And why wouldn't they? Why would you intentionally put yourself in a place where you might end up dead, or your children, or your grandchildren, or your spouse? The year 1963 was not all about death and destruction. And I was happy to include a section about the March on Washington that took place on August 28, 1963. Many Americans, black, white, and others, thought the march represented change in a way that the nation had not seen before. My protagonist and her family honestly believed that they might actually be witnessing the first black president speak when Martin Luther King delivered his "I Have a Dream" sermon. This feeling was felt throughout the country, and so many people felt that hope and change was in the air, even in 1963. So I'll read a little section. So this is the family sitting together in the living room after Dr. King has delivered his "I Have a Dream" sermon. "I gotta hand it to King," Daddy said, looking around the room, smiling at everyone. "He can speak like no other leader I've heard. We just might be looking at a future president of the United States." Grandma Perkins laughed. "Now you must have bumped your head, Cedric. Ain't no way these white folks gonna let a Negro be the president. I don't care how well he speaks." "Grandma, the world is changing," Alina said excitedly. "There's every reason for us to believe a Negro will be president someday. Mark my word, it will happen. And I think Dr. King will be the perfect candidate." "I'm not doubting his capabilities," Grandma Perkins said as she worked on her embroidery. I'm just saying these white folks ain't gonna stand for that. Maybe they'll let him be mayor or a city councilman, but King ain't never gonna be president. I decided to include this discussion in my next letter to Isaac, that's her friend. I wondered what he thought about it since he got to hear the sermon firsthand. Dear Isaac, my family's been discussing the possibility of a Negro president someday. Dad even thinks it could be Dr. King. It sounds phenomenal, but I can't imagine it ever happening. What do you think? Sincerely, Rose. Dear Rose, just a few short weeks ago, I would have said I doubt it, but after seeing Dr. King command the crowd in Washington, I have hope that one day we will see him raise his hand and take the oath of office, surrounded by Coretta and their children. That would definitely be a sight to see, and you must go to Washington when it happens. Best wishes, Isaac. There's something surreal writing about a situation that you already know the outcome. I already know Dr. King is not going to live to fulfill the dream that this family and others had for him. But I had to write it as if I didn't know that. I had to write it as if I didn't know what would transpire in this country over the next 8 years or so. So the hopefulness from this march only lasted a few more weeks. And that was when the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, was bombed by members of the KKK, killing 4 little girls, Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robertson, and Carol Denise McNair. Just like the country was in despair after these gruesome murders, so were my characters in Homeward. I remember it would have been about 1974, 75. My daddy and I, we went to a lot of church together. I felt like I spent 98% of my time in church. That's why I'm able to write about church so prolifically. So we were going to this same church, and Daddy was not one to mince words. I knew the story of 16th Street Baptist Church and these little girls. I knew what happened. And I remember the closer we got to Birmingham, the more afraid I became. And one thing I asked him was, Daddy, do you think those bad men will come back today? And I remember him saying, I hope not. I don't think they'll be back today. That's not what I wanted to hear. I wanted my big, strong daddy to reassure me that there was no way that those bad men would be able to get to us the way they got to those 4 little girls who were all going to Sunday school, dressed in their finest clothes. It was youth day. They were excited about taking part in the service. And this is where they will forever be frozen in our minds as little girls. Imagine the world and what it could have been like had Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robertson, and Carol Denise McNair, if they'd been given the opportunity to live. They would be in their 70s now. They would probably have grandchildren. They would probably be looking forward to the holidays coming up and preparing meals for their family. Maybe they would have been school teachers or lawyers or doctors or homemakers. But whatever they would have been, they are forever frozen as 4 little girls who never got the chance to see what this world was going to become. And then, just a couple of months later, on November 22nd, the country lost its president, and for many Black Americans, the closest that they thought they would ever come to a president who saw them and respected them. And I suppose I could have ended the story there. I could have allowed my characters to wallow in the despair of the past, but I wanted readers to recognize that even after all of the losses this country suffered in 1963, we are still standing. We're still standing. Bruised and battered, but still standing. If I could not leave a project with that feeling, I would find it extremely hard to do this work. It's exhausting for any of you who write about the past, especially the parts of the past that are traumatic. It is not easy to make yourself get up every day and put pen to paper and write about these atrocities, especially when sometimes it feels like we're living in a deja vu moment. But every day I dive deep into our past, encountering the ghosts of days gone by, and I try to make sense of their actions. I try to imagine myself in their time period, living in their skin, so that I can be honest and transparent about the past and tell these stories as honestly as I possibly can. Before I conclude, I wanted to share with you a bit of the research process that almost forced a part of my book not to happen. Later this afternoon, I will be teaching a workshop on the life of a writer, but part of the life of a writer involves doors, and oftentimes it's doors getting slammed in your face. In this novel, I knew that I wanted a scene where Dr. King preached at my fictional church. Y'all, I did all kinds of research. I looked at his schedule to see if he was available on that Sunday to preach in my fictional church. Exactly. Whoa. Thank you, little miss. I had all of my ducks in a row. I was ready. I reached out to the King Foundation to say, I don't want to use I Have a Dream or his mountaintop sermon. I just want a little obscure sermon that maybe no one knows about, and I can use a line or two in my book. That's all I want. They wanted thousands and thousands of dollars to use just a couple of few lines of his sermons. And so my publisher said, well, that was a good idea by half, but let's move on. And I said, absolutely not. Dr. King is going to come to my little fictional church, and he's going to preach there. So I devoted probably a good 3 to 4 months reading every sermon that was in print that Dr. King had ever preached. And I wrote my own sermon. And I later found out that Ava DuVernay was in the same boat, because when she tried to use sermon excerpts in the movie Selma, she was told no. And she has far more deeper pockets than I do. So I figured if Ava DuVernay wrote her own sermons for Dr. King. So if you go back now and watch Selma, there's not a single sermon in there that was actually preached by Dr. King. Those were all written by Ava DuVernay. So I'll conclude with just a small excerpt from my sermon. When peace like a river attendeth my way, he said, slowly repeating the words of the song. When I was a wee boy, I asked my daddy, what did those words mean? And he said, son, that's the kind of peace that rushes over you like a great rushing water. Today, saints, I will speak to you on the subject of peace. I had always imagined that Dr. King was at least 6 or 7 feet tall. He was not. He was a tiny man, but his presence was larger than life. One could quickly forget that he almost appeared delicate, easy to break. We have been taught as a people that peace is synonymous with allowing our right brothers and sisters to walk all over us. They are continuously and without impunity denying us our basic rights as human beings. We should be saying to them, no, sir, we will not stand by and swallow your disrespect in great gulps as if we were thirsting for it. But instead of doing that, we hang our heads in shame as we slink away, talking about we must keep the peace. Preach, doctor, somebody called out. Teach us, teacher, another person yelled. I don't know about y'all's Bibles here in Parsons, Georgia, but mine teaches that Jesus came to declare war on evil. Do y'all's Bible teach that? Yes, sir, someone says it sure does. Well, then let me tell y'all a short story from that good book we all have in common. That book tells me that when Jesus decided that peace was not going to work among those leaders in the temple, Jesus had to move. That's what happens when our lives are guided by the Spirit. No matter what, when it says move, we have no choice but to move. Thank you so much. I so appreciate your attentiveness. And I just want to say to every one of you in here, I don't know how many of you have the desire to be a writer. I just want to say a word of encouragement. Don't allow anything or anyone to stop your dream to write. I didn't publish my first work of fiction until I was in my 40s. I wrote my entire life, and no one could have told me that I wasn't a writer. And having HarperCollins on the back of my book did not make me a writer. Having a degree that had my name on it did not make me a writer. What made me a writer was that every single day I showed up to the page. I gave love to my characters and the world that they inhabited. And I found joy in every single sentence, even if no one read it but me. So if you have the desire to be a writer, don't allow anyone, anywhere, to tell you that you are anything other than a writer. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're going to have a moment, so be thinking of your questions. We'll have a moment for questions and answers. I'm going to take a seat because I have the first one. Thank you, friend. Shout out to our amazing tech team. They do an extraordinary job all of the time. I am moved almost beyond speech, but I'm going to try because I prepped in advance, so I'd have a question. You said, I am my ancestor's greatest hope. That was one of the things you said, and that resonates deeply with me. I was wondering, with you and your history, where you are now, what does success look like for you? What does it mean to you? And do you think it's the same as what success means for your characters, for Eva or Opal or Rose?
Yeah, for me, success is really more the low-hanging fruit than the higher fruit on the tree, if I were to use that as a metaphor. It's the small victories. It's the finally having a life that affords me the opportunity to do the thing that I love the most, which is to tell stories. And it allows me to shed a light on people who often don't get the opportunity to have their stories told. The first creative writing class I took in college, the teacher said to me after I turned in a story that no one was interested in reading about country black people or about slavery, that time had passed for those stories to be told, to move on. And because I thought she's a teacher and teachers know everything, I believed her, and I put my pen away for a while. And a series of events happened that allowed me to go back to writing. And I realize now just how important as a teacher, and that to me is as important as my writing, how important it is for me as a teacher to speak life into my students every single day. And it doesn't matter if they are going to write a New York Times bestseller or if they're going to write little cards that they give to their family on the holidays. That it's my job to speak life and joy and happiness and all of the positivity, because the world is so filled with people saying no, that as a teacher, it's my job to be the one to say yes. So those are the things that I celebrate the most. All of this other stuff is wonderful, but it's those little intimate moments when a student comes to my office and they say, I'm writing again. And I'm like, yes, we scored this week.
That's amazing. And now I want to go back to Bloomington
Come
and
on.
re-enroll.
Come on.
We have a couple folks with microphones. If you have a question and you'd raise your hand, we'd like you to wait for a microphone because we are recording this, and that'll help your voice be carried over to people who view this in the future. I see a one right here in front. You can just hold up your hand. We'll get a microphone to you.
I just wanted to ask, how do you make your characters feel alive, like they're not stale, like they actually feel like a real person?
Oh, I wish you could be in my workshop this afternoon. Okay, you're going to have to come by and get a business card from me, and I'll share with you my PowerPoint that I'm going to share with them this afternoon. I do a lot of work in the front end so that on the back end, they really are real people once I start writing chapter 1. I sit with them. I do a character analysis. I know everything about them. I'm a little girl from rural Alabama who grew up in a Baptist church, and I always remember the preacher saying, God knows everything about you, even the number of hairs on your head. I'm not that close to knowing about my characters, but I'm getting there in terms of I want to know the details about them, because if you know their past, you understand why they're behaving the way they are in the present. If you know their backstory, if you know the details about their family, if you know where they fall in the birth order in their family, if you know if they grew up rich or poor or middle class, if you know if they grew up in the South or in the North, if you know details about your characters, you can predict how they're going to behave in almost any scenario. So I do a lot of work to get to know these people so that by the time I start actually writing, they feel like real people. They feel like people that I know. They're my family. So when they start feeling like real people to you, then you know it's time to start writing their story.
Building on that, as you're creating these fictional characters and embedding them into real events or real characters based on real people, and I loved you telling us how you looked at Dr. King's schedule and made sure he was available. Do you have any advice or best practices for how you mesh the two worlds and while honoring their stories, I guess?
Right. I say that I treat history as if, so let's imagine we were driving from Fort Wayne back to Bloomington. There's a lot of little side towns that we could go off and visit and see. Like we could go into Anderson, we could meander into all through Indianapolis and do all sorts of stuff. But eventually we're going to get back on that main highway and make our way into Bloomington. So I am willing to take little, detours away from the main line of history, but eventually I'm going to get us back there. So the reason why it's so important to me to know where Dr. King was on that Sunday is because I'm also writing for historians. I wanted to be a historian. I think I am in some ways, but I wanted to study history. But my history teacher back in the day said, you love making up stories more than you like telling true stories. But what I realized is I could marry both. And so I want a historian to pick up my book and to be able to say, that really could happen. In fact, most of this did happen. So I wouldn't choose to have Dr. King preach at my church on the Sunday that he was preaching at Ebenezer Baptist Church and delivering a very powerful sermon that's all in the history books or all in the books written about Dr. King. So I really do try to stick as close to the truth as possible. But I do like playing. And so one of my characters has a huge crush on John Lewis. So throughout the story, we see her just fawning over John Lewis. But eventually I let him get with his wife that he was intended to be with.
I'm real emotional today, so
You're okay.
bear with me.
You're okay. Just take a breath.
just for the record, I've been to a funeral and a wedding, sort of, in the last 24 hours, all at the same hospital room. So it's been a lot. But this is important to be here, and I'm so grateful that I'm getting to sit and hear and learn from you. Thank you for coming here to speak to us. Thank you, Beth, and to the library for putting on this event. But my question is, I have decades of stories oozing out of every pore, but because of the sensitive nature of it's not just my story, because like you told your story, you're telling your father's story too, and you're sharing your personal shame in that moment. You're sharing these intimate, deep bits of our family. Can you speak to, do you have people that you go to talk through those things? Because it feels so overwhelming.
I'm gonna come hug you when this is all over. So I just want you to know that. I don't know how y'all just sitting there. I would be right there with this. You're okay. You're okay. And what your question is absolutely on the mark. Honey, I still see a therapist. I still talk through stuff. This is not easy, this life that we live. My daddy used to say, the longer you live, the more goodbyes you're going to have to say, and it's not easy. I also recognize in my writing that I've made certain decisions in terms of I will not protect those that don't deserve to be protected. There are family stories that I sat on and only shared with my therapist for years, and I finally told in my book of poetry. And I have family members to this day that still won't speak to me. But I recognize that telling my truth was more important than protecting people that didn't protect me. So, sometimes you just have to figure out, what can you live with? Can you live with the fact that great Aunt Sally won't speak to you anymore or give you a fruit pie for the holidays? Are you okay with that? And it's really who do you feel needs to be protected? And what part of the stories are important that you share? I've never told a story about a family member or about sensitive topics without at least giving people a heads up. But I never say to them, I need your permission to tell this story. By the time I get to that point, I've already decided I'm going to tell the story. And I'm just letting you know that it's coming. But I want you to be at peace with whatever you decide. It's more about your peace than it is anyone else's. And then writing a story does not mean it has to be published. I have a lot of stories that I've put on page will never see the light of day because it's for me and my healing, not to save the world.
But see, I want to save the world. I want to do what you're doing. I want to take these words and these stories and I want to educate while I entertain. And they don't even know that their mind, their worldview is being shifted because I'm so excited to be here. Thank you.
I'm excited you're here, but you can't do that work if you're so broken inside after telling it. You're serving no purpose. The only reason why I'm able to stand here and share with you that story about what happened on that backcountry road with my dad is I did the work to heal. There are times in my life I would have been prostrate on this floor trying to tell that to y'all, but I had to get to a place where I was healthy enough to share it. So make sure that's what you do for yourself.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here today. This kind of bounces off this last part of our conversation. Something I really admire in your work is a certain restraint that I feel. So that when the book I've just finished is When Stars Rain Down. So there's, the beginning of this book, you sort of warn us that something's coming, and it's set in the 30s, and you're afraid you're going to see a body hanging from a tree by the end of the book, and you manage not to do quite that. The same with, when somebody's like coming at the door, and this woman, their character has a gun in her hand, and you manage to make us understand what it would have been like if she had shot the gun without actually doing that. The same when she's attacked. You know, we all know what is actually likely to have happened, and you manage to not quite go there, but you give us the emotional experience while still protecting your character in a way, you know? So I just really admire how you do that. And I write for young adults, and I have been wondering as I've been reading your books if you have thought of doing that, Angela. I think you'd be an amazing author for children or young adults if you ever attempted to go in that direction. Although I think also your books for adults will also find an audience among teens, you know, because they're so coming of age. But anyway, thank you so much for being here. And if you have anything more to say about that restraint and how you manage that when you're dealing with this such difficult history, I'd love to hear more.
Thank you for that, and thank you for that wonderful compliment. I do have some young readers. I recognize that some of the topics I tackle are a lot, and also know the world we live in. I had a librarian from Florida tell me that my book would probably get banned. I'm like, well, couldn't you have led with congratulations? But okay. But in terms of the restraint, I always think of writing sort of like getting dressed. Like if y'all saw me this morning, I had on a scarf, and I had on these earrings, and I had on a necklace, and I had on a belt and some more stuff, and then I just started, I'm like, okay, you looking like a Christmas tree, start taking some accessories off. And I think that's the same with writing. I think sometimes we throw everything and the kitchen sink into a story, when really it's not necessary. The effect that we're after, I think the emotions that I'm after often happen with scenes that are more subtle. We've already seen the worst of racism in movies and books. We've seen it. We know what it looks like. So I'm more interested in showing the more subtle aspects of racism that maybe we aren't aware of. The scene with the chickens, I won't say any more than that for anyone who hasn't read, but that scene happened after I had written what you had described, this horrendous scene where the Klan marched in and did these terrible, atrocious things, and it was just violence on top of violence on top of violence. And I really thought that the story would be served better by something more subtle that would affect a reader in a way that maybe they had not been affected before, or seen racism in a way that maybe they had not looked at it before.
We have time for just a couple more.
I'm amazed at how, when you tell a story, especially that part about your father and you, or the characters were stopped by the policeman, it triggered a memory for me of how contrasting but the same between the North and the South. Now, my family, we were driving to Niagara Falls for a family vacation, and there was an accident, big accident, and we approached. My father worked for the U.S. government. He was a railway mail clerk, so he had to carry a gun, working on a train and everything. And he just naturally got out of the car to see what was going on. There was this white cop who was sweeping glass away from the accident. And my father just asked him, what's going on? Can I be of any help and everything? I work for the government. And he said, get the hell out of here. You know, nobody asked you anything. But my father stood up to him and said, listen, I work for the government. I carry a gun and a badge. I'm used to this kind of stuff. Don't give me any hassle. The point of it is, like, the girl was ashamed of her father because he had to act in a certain way for survival of her. Yes. He was thinking of her. Where, in contrast, I was proud of my father when he told that guy, that white cop, you know, and the other cop said, leave this man alone. He's trying to help us. And it's just amazing how down south it was the fact. Up north, it was de facto. Yeah. Same difference, just different ways of expressing itself.
Oh, that's an amazing
Thanks
story.
for that snippet.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that.
We have time for just one more. I want to make sure somebody's waiting in the front row. I give them a quick chance. This will be our last question. But once we wrap up, I invite you to come on up in about 10 minutes. Angela will be up in our great hall upstairs. Her books will be for sale, and she'll be there to sign and answer any more questions you might have.
Hey, Angela. What's up, sis? I have this thing where I tell my students this, that when the book is published, it's 18 years old, and it's going out into the world. And that's my child going out into the world. I have no control over how people feel. You know, oh, your book is this, or whatever. Or, yeah, she's in your face. That's how she is, whatever. But what I'm getting at is you give birth to this thing. And so I wanted to know, what have you learned about your child and yourself? And now that we're here, now that you're here at this point.
Say that last part one more time. What
have you learned about your child homeward and yourself?
Oh, gracious. Oh, that's a good question. What have I learned? I've learned about just the resilience of my people and how we were able to take the worst possible scenarios that could, in 7 months, all of the things that I talked about happened to our country and the people in our country. And yet, Black people still found joy. They still danced. They still sang. They still had relations. They still did all of the things that when we really think about our stories and how they've been told, it feels like all we're told that happens is that it was just one trauma after the next trauma after the next trauma after the next trauma. But there was so much joy and happiness in those days, and that I'm so happy that I was able to discover that in the writing of this book. Because in my initial thought, I was just focusing on the trauma. I was laser focused on those 1960 to 1963 and getting all the trauma exactly the way it was supposed to be, and I forgot about the joy. So through revision, I was able to go back and revisit these stories and really center in on the joy. And I promise you, there's a lot to be sad about and to cry over, but there's even more to rejoice and to see in these characters' resilience that I saw in my dad and my uncles and my aunts and all of the people in my family who picked cotton for a living, but still found a way to come together and sit underneath the pecan trees and tell stories and sing songs and think about the fact that one day that little brown-skinned girl of theirs was going to be sitting in the Allen County Public Library reading and talking to all of you on a Saturday morning. So yeah, that's what I discovered.
Thank you.
I cannot thank you enough, friend. I would like to say thank you on behalf of all of Fort Wayne with this little goodie basket of Fort Wayne lovies. We've got some brands and some other goodness to persuade you to come back another time, because it's going to be you're going to be so delighted. We are just extraordinarily grateful. So thank you for coming.
Thank you so much.
Truly. As I mentioned, Ms. Jackson-Brown will be in the Great Hall to sign books and to chat for the next little while after she has a quick. And at 2 o'clock, we have our writer's workshop. It is sold out, but as with all library programs, your reservations hold seats until the event starts, and we'll be happy to fill in extra seats if you would like to have time to stick around and see if you can catch a freebie if somebody wasn't able to make it. We invite you to stick around. Thank you so much for coming, and have a great day.
Production facilities provided by Access Fort Wayne. Learn more under the Explore tab at acpl.info.